Greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Obachashaka Show. How's everybody doing? We have some special treats for you today in terms of a topic. I want to, as people are watching this show, if you like it, note that by hitting the like button. And for new viewers, make a point of hitting the red button, which subscribes you to the show. And I want to welcome Kurt Thomas, Sister Robin, Ubun to Gist. I know I messed your name up, sorry. Welcome to the show. Sister Robin, who was one of the first viewers of the show, long time viewer, welcome to you and others as you come on. I'd like to encourage people who are new to the show to Brother Andy Sawyer, welcome. For people who are new to the show, go back to the various shows that we've had that are now 151, and they're chapters in a book. And you might look at them in terms of sequences, as I pointed out before. To Brother Edward K., Brother Ugawa, hey, they beat you on, brother, today. What's happening? And Sister Lisa, greetings to you all. So these shows are an expression of my love to you, to my people, to all of my people, and to humanity at large, and especially to young folks who have to pick up the mantle in the Black Freedom Army. And so this is the main reason that I'm doing the show. I regard this show as an art form, and each of these are my best. They're artistic expressions given in the form of history, politics, both African American. Our art form itself is, Brother Ugawa says, and I agree with him, my best show is the spiritual blues. And that's because that's the foundation of our art form, and that's pure beauty. I'm a poet, and the only time I do poetry is when I'm in the romantic mood, usually when I'm courting a lady. So my current wife, she got a lot of poetry. There were some ladies that came through that I was checking out, and when I was inspired, they get some poetry, one of which wanted to come back. She's very young, and mainly she wanted to hear the poetry. Then I'm an OG to her. I'm actually an OR, an original revolutionary. So she wanted to hear that poetry. But as strategy is, next to God and love, the ultimate art, the fate of people depend upon it. And just as love is a art form in which you put a smile on your lover's face, strategy will put the ultimate smile on a people's face. It's such a subtle art form that when it's expressed, only a master can see it. And of all the things I do, my first love is the truth, and ultimately that's God. But it's strategy. I'm a strategist. I've never lost a battle, and I only fight for a just cause and when I can win. And God's given me that gift to instinctively know my opponent's weaknesses. But when I haven't, and it's only been one time when we went up against the largest bank in the world, the Bank of America, I assembled the smartest people I had, and we came up with a strategy. It's the only time I needed help. So the subject for today is a master strategist on the world level, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And for you who are Afrocentric, We have some that are only interested in Kemet. You're into escapism if that is the way in which you interpret African history, because you use your past to transform your present. And you use it as a weapon in the war for Black liberation, for African liberation on your level. I'm not saying you got to do what I do. Do your thing. If it's on the art level, whatever it is, do that. So these shows have been my best for each subject, and they're going to be turned into books. They're chapters in a book. They're in art form. So I'm presenting beauty. And so you don't hear the N word. Nobody comes on this show can use it. I don't want to hear it. And in fact, the people I have on the show wouldn't use it, because the users of the N word, their mindset is in the slave modality, if you know what I mean. The degraded mentality. And so instead of them spreading beauty, they might be, to an extent, a lot of what they're putting out is ugliness. And we're too beautiful to be spreading ugliness on the planet or anywhere else. So I'm doing my best to share what I have with you, and then I bring on the best. When we have anyone on here, they're our very best. Theophilo Benga, the best, and Dynastic Kemet, and a number of others that we have had. So it's the love I'm receiving from you, and then I'm exchanging with you, because this is an act of love. It's a lot of hard work doing this stuff. Hard work. But then that's the nature of liberation. Liberation comes with a price. As Frederick Douglass said, the mighty roar of the oceans, you know? And there ain't no way in the world liberation's going to be passed out on some free plate. You're going to have to grab it, baby, you know? It's really good to see how the show is growing. Ogawa and I were somewhat surprised that the show that I did on Kemet, ancient Kemet, that focused on the first occasion, Septepi, why the Kemites saw, and other Africans saw, the first occasion is the most important thing, and for the Kemites it was Septepi, and why the Europeans focused on the theory of evolution. One of the questions that came after the show was, why did the European focus on evolution? I thought I answered it. Because as a material people, they're going to look for a material answer, and God ain't going to figure anywhere in it. And some of my people think that the Big Bang Theory excludes God. Some even have told me, because they're not into astrophysics, they don't believe in, the Big Bang Theory. This ain't got nothing to do with belief. I don't believe in God. I know God. I've seen God. You understand? I don't believe in the truth. As the Kemite says, speak truth, do truth. It's a practice. It's an experience. It's a reality. Belief is sometimes focusing on some things you may doubt and you just take for granted. So you believe. I don't believe that 1 and 1 equals 2. 1 and 1 equals 2. You know what I mean? So for those that had that question still, a material people are going to produce material thing of origin. And God ain't going to be anywhere in it, even when the origin is basically spirit-based. So they're caught in trouble. You dig? But we've grown. And that show alone has been generating almost 1,000 views a day. And so right now we're probably well over 14,000 views on that, and well over 300 new subscribers just coming from that show. And we're in the mid 6,000 viewers right now, 6,400 and something. And so Ogawa and I had set as a target 10,000 for the end of the year. It's easy to say now, it'll be easy to meet that target. will exceed it. But what's interesting about this show is 20% of the subscribers are regular viewers. So some people have 1 million subscribers and they're generating a couple of thousand views a show or whatever. It's not the number of subscribers, it's the number of people who are really dedicated to what's going on. And for me, I'm happiest when I've got viewers who are serious and want to use this to change their lives and change the conditions in their community. Welcome to Wolf Manlu, who's one of our real sharp brothers, conscious, that's regularly on this show. Gloria Briscoe, who's been on quite regularly. Greetings to you. Chad Jomo Kenyatta, greetings to you. Yeah, the Last Poets, man. That's you talk about some art form. You know what I mean? Yeah. So this show is growing, and that's good. And we were also privileged when we had on a brother from South Africa about a month and a half ago. And that generated 800 new subscribers. And he's a beautiful brother, and he has a solid following in South Africa. So last week, last Sunday, it was my privilege to pre-record an interview with Ana Maria Cabral, Amilcar Cabral's wife. And that was a pure pleasure. She is a lovely, beautiful, brilliant, brave sister. She was brought out here by Women's Warrior Project in New Bedford, and they were honoring her and other African women warriors who have been active in the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. She's 1 year younger than me. So we were privileged to have the honor to interview her. And so this show is in part designed to discuss a very brilliant brother, Amilcar Cabral, who's in the background, the guy with the sunglasses here. But it was especially set up for today to provide background for the interview with Ana Maria Cabral, because what they were doing in bringing her out to this country was to honor her and the women warriors who fought in the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde. And this is important because our women are not often given the acknowledgement and the honor that they deserve for the role that they played, which has often been a very leading role. As my friend Kendi Solowazi, my best friend, says, it's African women, and that includes you African Americans, in case you think I'm excluding you, that make things happen. If you want to see a movement get off the ground, African women are all over it because they're the ones that make things happen, just like they brought your buddy into the world and then encourage you to make things happen, you know? So this show is especially being done to both honor a great revolutionary leader, Amilcar Cabral, but especially to provide the background for honoring Ana Maria Cabral. And so you'll see that next week. And I want to thank the African Women's Warrior Project for bringing her out and also agreeing to that interview. It was Ana Maria Cabral that agreed, but they presented it to her, and she went along with that. So that will be the subject of next week's show. And Ana Maria Cabral is an embodiment of the qualities of African womanhood. And that's the African American. You can call it Black, whatever you want. she's a real manifestation of that. And she's not alone. You got a whole lot of sisters who have those same qualities. So the show today is on Amilcar Cabral, who's, I can make the general statement, one of the greatest leaders in the 20th century, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others who know his record. He's the greatest leader. Now, of course, I'll see people coming from a certain country and they'll put up theirs, or there will be people who are offended because I didn't say Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey. And I didn't say in the history of the world, I said in the 20th century. And the reason that I say that, and many others, is he has the best record. But that's also the record of the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And so any people are blessed when they can give birth to a really exceptional human being. And all of our people, all African people, have been able to do that. Your mother is an exceptional human being. In most cases, your father. And some of you in your generation may not even know their names, but it's the qualities of your parents, the qualities of the people that you consider your friends that make them great people. But in this particular case, it is the qualities of leadership that Amilcar Cabral manifested through a very difficult struggle against Portuguese colonialism. And those qualities had to deal with, first, moral qualities, because without those, I don't care what he achieved, it wouldn't mean anything. He was a great human being, and he was a humanist by nature. And then he brought into the equation brilliance. Now, we often don't know what brilliance is because we think you got to be a straight A student to be a brilliant person. He was probably that or close to that, but that isn't the real requirement. Brilliance is expressed in how whatever it is you think and do is manifested in life, and how effective are you in carrying those out. And so it was his achievements in the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau and for the independence of Cape Verde as well, that you saw brilliance that was exceptional in world history in the 20th century. And in my estimation, Cabral ranks above the greatest leaders in the 20th century. And those are, and see, often the Mexican Revolution doesn't get credit. But the second largest revolution in the 20th century was the Mexican Revolution. And by the way, that's one of my specialties, Mexico. I organized Mexicans. I organized a good part of a piece of Americana. And I didn't study them because of my involvement in organizing, but because they're an important group and I was interested in their culture. And of course, we know the Olmec culture is the mother culture of Mexico or Mesoamerica. And so the greatest leader in the Mexican Revolution was a man named Emiliano Zapata. I can't show you, but I have a picture of him right behind my computer, given to me by the chair of La Raza Studies at San Francisco State. That's Mexican American and then Latino, but La Raza is referring to Mexican American people. Jose Cuellar, who's a Mexican American PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley, but he plays the saxophone. They call him Dr. Loco, Dr. Crazy. I like the brother. And so he gave me this picture and I framed it. Emiliano Zapata, who also, I'm a Leo, he was a Leo. His grandmother was African. He's Mexican. The Mexican is a mix of three people, Indian, African, and Spanish. The worst part is the Spanish. Hey, Susan, I'm so glad that you came on. So lovely. Y'all need to support Pan-African DTV. And Susan, anytime you want me on, I'm ready. She's got a bad show. And she's been all over Africa and Tanzania. So lady from the Cameroon, pretty too, huh? Got us some grown children. She's a business lady too. I know that. We haven't talked about her background, but she's Dr. Susan Tata, and she's good at doctoring your head. And one of the favorite people she has on her show is my good friend. You know, you all should know who that is. You know, brother from New York. Susan, tell them who that is. Put that up there. Your favorite New York brother there before I do. Type it in. So Amilcar Cabral ranks above this great leader. Yeah, she put down there Uncle James Smalls. Yeah, I was expecting her to somebody else. That's my buddy. He's on regularly on the Pan-African DTV. So Amilcar Cabral ranks above him, and this was one great leader. And the Mexican Revolution doesn't get the credit it deserves because it was one of the longest lasting and biggest, only the Chinese being bigger. The only two you get to really see pushed in the 20th century is the Russian and Chinese Revolution. So he was a great leader. And the main reason is he had a vision. And the vision was sharing the land. It was communalism. The land, air, and water is not owned by any individual, but shared collectively. He came from Morelos, which is the African area of Mexico. That's why his grandmother was African. And so he had that vision coming from his culture. And he took no money from the forces that he was fighting. And so he was a great leader. Amilcar Cabral ranks above him, but this is a great leader, a great leader. And he was a man of style. He rode horses. He was somebody that before he joined the revolution and led it in the southern part of Mexico, rode horses and broke them, to tame them. And the women loved him. Real good looking brother. And if you see the pictures of him, he's very dark in complexion, but the Mexicans like to lighten him up every now and then. Ranks above him. In the revolution that occurred in Vietnam, the greatest leader and one of the greatest leaders in the world was Ho Chi Minh. He was great because, again, of his integrity. And notice I'm going across races. I know some of you just deal with Africans. I'm revolutionary. I deal with the whole world. You know what I mean? And I study the world. By the way, you ain't going to whip an enemy that's global unless you have global strategies that come out of your culture, but then you take the best from anywhere in the world that you can. That's what my books, The Art of Leadership, are. Drawing African culture, African American culture, and leadership systems, but then the best stuff that's used in the world. Because they're going to throw their best stuff at you. You better have better, So Ho Chi Minh, what made him really great? His integrity. He was a Confucianist. So ethics meant more to him than anything else. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. He wasn't like a lot of these gangsters who are running states in the United States. Leave office broke, and in a few years, they 100, 200 millionaires, or the gangsters that run Africa, who care more about their bank accounts than their people and are backed by armed force, This was a man who cared about his people, and in the end, was the leader of the struggle. There were other leaders that actually led the armed struggle that defeated the French and the Americans. And, they put a little foot behind the Japanese as they were falling in World War II. Great leader. Mao Zedong, he led the armed struggle in China, took Chiang Lai's place, and was an intellectual as well as a warrior. And he did certain things that Cabral did, but Cabral did it, I think, in even a better way. And I'll talk about that when I get to it. So he was bad, as in good. Of course, he had his problems. He wasn't perfect because Chinese leaders are emperors. And so they one-man rule. And so if this one man is off, then you're in trouble. But by and large, he was on, greater than him. And I don't even need to put Stalin in the picture. He was a mass killer. Lenin was okay, but greater than him. And I'll say one reason is, as we get into Amilcar Cabral's thoughts, you'll see his work better, actually. And then Castro was good. He had his problems, but he was good. I respect him. Any country that would send an army, in this case into Africa, and over 60% of the Cubans are Africans, just on principle, to kick the South Africans behind. When he went into Angola, that was a great achievement. I have my critique of him. I'm not giving it, but he was a great leader. And his intelligence operation, which the Russians trained his people in, but Castro ran it, was better than the CIA. I won't go into why. I've mentioned it a few times on the show before. Castro was great. Amilcar Cabral ranks above him, in my humble opinion. Of course, there will be some people who are different, and that's all right. You understand? Notice, I'm not putting myself in that category. I'm not putting Malcolm, and I wear a goatee because of Malcolm. I'm not putting Garvey. They were all great leaders. Amilcar Cabral. So it was his character, his thoughts, his role as a strategist, his overall ideas on at least the overall orchestration of the armed struggle, though he himself was never involved in the armed struggle himself. He was the leader of it and is a person who shaped the leadership around him. It was all of that. But I would say most important of all was his good character. He was a good human being. And so I'm offering this to Amilcar Cabral. He's in heaven. And I just want to say to you, brother, I love you. I didn't know about you when I was in the thick of my battles from 60 to 63. I discovered you probably around 65, 66, 67. And some of the transformations we went through that we'll talk about today, that Amilcar Cabral went through, we went through. I went through, Malcolm and others, and we'll talk about that. So, brother, I want to say to you up there in your lurch in heaven, this is an offering to you and to your people, your heroic people who fought the good fight. This comes from my heart. You don't see that picture behind me for no reason. I mean, I've been in the movement 63 years. And if I'm still drawing from some examples from somebody, they really got something to offer. And please believe me, Amilcar Cabral did. And his lessons still resonate to this day. So the topic for today's show is Amilcar Cabral's assertion that the liberation movement is an act of culture. And so this is what you're going to hear over and over again in this show, is the role that African, and don't misinterpret this, African American, New African, African Caribbean, African diasporan, I don't care what part of the world you're coming from, the role that African culture plays in the liberation movement. Now, his assertion was that the liberation movement is an act of culture, which goes beyond Africa, because if you look at every liberation movement that has taken place in the world, you will find those liberation movements are playing out their culture. It is no accident that Joseph Stalin, as a leader of Russia, after the death of Lenin, that he would be as brutal as he was. He was acting out the most negative features of Russian culture. The czars were brutal. And so it's not just African culture that is the main expression of African liberation movements, but every culture is going to come out in the liberation movements that come forward. And so the question is, which part of it, the positive or the negative? You understand? And since, as I pointed out before, the Russians, the Ukrainians, give birth to Aryanism along with the people living in the Caucasus Mountains. And so they give birth to a very brutal Aryan lord and master culture. And you're seeing it played out today with your president. Being at a major summit of NATO, giving the two-step to Ukraine. They've encouraged them to fight, but they have no intention of admitting them to the European Union or to NATO. And if they did right now, then it would guarantee that war would go on forever. But you've seen the Cold War talk coming out of the mouth of your president, Biden, who we put in office. And I supported the move to defeat Trump. I didn't support Biden. I supported ending Trump's presidency. That's a part of the exercise of power. You don't have to like somebody, but his foreign policy is terrible. Up here talking Cold Warism. That's an expression of American culture. America's only had about 18 years where it didn't have a war. Always talking this peace. And I got some people telling me the land of the free and the home of the brave. Black, I'm saying, are you crazy? Land of the free? Huh. You mean free looting, free genocide, free slavery, freedom my black behind. As someone said in one of the write-ups when I did this last week, I was doing a riff on this. They said something about home of the slave and of the knave or something like that. You know what I mean? Land of the free and the brave. Since when has the Klan been brave? I've had some meetings with the Klan. I haven't talked about it. Klan's a bunch of cowards. Got to stick a sheet on. And if any of them are brave, because bravery is not the first virtue. Truth is, the pursuit of truth. I've seen some real corrupt, brave people. So, fearlessness is a good thing. That's the African definition of bravery. But in pursuit of what? If you're in the pursuit of wrong, that's not a virtue. So, courage is kind of like a neutral thing. It depends on what it's tied to. If it's tied to justice and truth, ma'an, then bravery is a high virtue. Some of our people have ranked it first because maybe in their life, the most important thing they did was overcome fear. So I understand that. I'm not knocking it. So the topic for today is Amilcar Cabral's assertion, the liberation movement is an act of culture. So the first thing to understand is that the people that make up the liberation movement that Cabral led came from mainly Guinea-Bissau, and some of them came from Cape Verde. And they were rising up against Portuguese colonialism. Portugal was among the poorest of the Western colonial powers. And so, along with Spain, they held on to the colonies of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Angola and Mozambique. Those were their main colonies. But they didn't have the power of Britain or France or even Germany. They got only a small piece of Africa. But because they made a fateful and correct decision during World War II not to join either side, and if they had, they would have probably joined the Germans. They were fascists. And in fact, Spain had been supported by Hitler during their civil war preceding World War II. But they were neutral. And as a result, their countries didn't get bombed out. And so they came out of World War II with the illusion that they could still hold on to their colonies. Whereas Britain had engaged in a war, 2 world wars against Germany, France, and their power was completely sapped, gone. And so they knew they had to walk away from Africa. So peaceful struggles could win in a colonial situation like that. But the Portuguese and then the French, while their power had been sapped, they still held on to some illusion that they could still hold it. So they held on in Vietnam until a general named Giap, who was a history teacher, kicked their butt at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and kicked the French out of Vietnam. But they were still holding on in Algeria. They thought they could fight. And so the Arabs got their thing together. And they had an armed struggle in Algeria and kicked the French's behind. You understand? So the French didn't get the message right away. And then eventually they had to step out of Africa. They had, I won't go into the details, but they eventually had to. And Guinea, which would serve as the base for the PAIGC, Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, would be able to use the Republic of Guinea under Sekou Touré, who was the first of the Francophone country leaders, to stand up to France. And when they offered them something less than independence, he said, hell no. And when the French pulled out, they took everything they had out. Telephone poles, everything. But what the Guineans had was freedom. And then later, Amilcar Cabral and the PAIGC would have a base area where they could begin to train freedom fighters. So this was a particular quality that led the Portuguese to hold on and would eventually lead Cabral and his party to conclude that the only way they could fight for a successful liberation of Guinea-Bissau, and they hoped of Cape Verde, would be through an armed struggle. And so the impact of Portuguese colonialism on Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde was severe. Over 50,000 people from Cape Verde alone died during World War II to starvation. And that starvation was caused by the colonial policies of Portugal that generally confined the economy to a one-crop economy and generally bled both Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau of its natural resources, which were very few. And it also explains why the Portuguese did not settle in either Cape Verde or in Guinea-Bissau, because there were no natural raw materials. This would also mean it would be harder for the PAIGC, the Liberation Organization, to organize the people of Guinea-Bissau, because they didn't see a direct Portuguese presence as they saw in Angola and Mozambique. Their presence was through tax collectors, few officials that were based throughout Guinea-Bissau. And in the case of Cape Verde, the Cape Verdes were allowed to get an education, and they often played a role as lower level administrators in the colonial system, with some defecting to the armed struggle later. So it's this kind of colonialism that the PAIGC, organized by Amilcar Cabral, would have to go up against. Now, the overall purpose of this presentation is a little different from what would normally be done. Normally, you'd expect this to be a biographical thing on Cabral. No, this is going to be different. Though I'm going to deal with some aspects of his life so that you understand who he was and who contributed in his family and whatnot to his growth and development. The purpose of today's program is to analyze the strategies and tactics of Amilcar Cabral and compare them to strategies and tactics of Africans in the United States, such as Malcolm X, Ella Baker, in some cases, the Black Panther Party, the Black Freedom Movement overall, and in Africa, especially to compare them to the strategies of, I think, the leader in Africa that was most productive and had the best solution for African economic independence, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, who had the privilege to meet, and we had discussions in 1967, a couple hours in front of his house. And my organization, Pan-African Peoples Organization, worked in the villages of Tanzania in 1973 for 3 months, working in what was the best program put forward by an African leader, one that Cabral would have pushed had he lived, Ujamaa villages. Ujamaa, Ujamaa, meaning sharing through the family. And Nyerere was a product of a village organization. And he was inculcated with village values. And as a result, for a good 12 years, had that instilled in him. And so that was the program that he put forward for his people. So in 73, Pan-African Peoples Organization, which I still chair, we sent a team of 10 people, myself included, along with my wife, Anasa Tashaka, a brother who watches this show regularly, Kushinda and Akara. Akara right now is recovering from knee surgery. Kushinda is taking care of his wife. They have a great relationship. I married them in the 70s. I actually have a picture in one of our newspapers of her being carried in on an African chair. And we had to get Kushinda up to doing a dance. Kushinda is a 4th degree black belt in karate and a 1st degree in judo. He's a master combat martial artist and one of the best people we had in Pan-African Peoples Organization. He also went through a transformational process that we will be discussing in the context of Amilcar Cabral. So it was that work in Africa that enabled me to really grow. And it was part of our work in contributing to the liberation movement in Africa while we're engaged in our own liberation struggle in the United States. So this is going to be a comparative look at some of the ideas, strategies, and tactics and experiences of transformation coming out of Amilcar Cabral that was shared by Africans in the United States, in Africa, and in other parts of the world. And always I'm using this to use the past so that you can use it to change the present. So I'm also going to be looking at how the liberation movement that Cabral described as an expression of culture, which is global for African people, what are some of the historical lessons that we learn from these movements? And what are some of the common cultural unities that African people engaged in struggle draw from? Cabral wasn't so much focused on the common cultural unities, but they did among African people, but they did play a role in waking him up. And I'll be going into that. But that's important because it explains why we went through some of the same kinds of approaches to struggle, because there was an African framework in spite of the attacks carried out on African culture. So this will also be looking at what are some of the organic systems that evolve out of a people's culture being attacked. And so in the recovery process of culture, what are some of the organic systems that emerged. And these are global. And to the extent that some of our Black liberation movements in the US did not undergo these processes of transformation of consciousness, they failed. And to the extent that they did, they were successful. And the key to all of this was you had to immerse yourself in a transformational system. So what were some of the organic features of change that didn't come out of ancient Africa? It came out of the need for us to recover our sense of who we are, our sense of identity, our sense of self-love and self-respect. So first, I want to deal with some of the background of Amilcar Cabral because that background is important for understanding him. Amilcar Cabral was born September 2nd, 1934 in Guinea-Bissau, a place called Bafata, B-A-F-A-T-A, 1934. He was 5 years older than me. I was born in 1939. He was given by his father the name Amilcar. Now, some historians have tried to make little of this, and this is usually going to be white historians. They're going to say, well, his father, who I'll get into in a minute, didn't really have anything much in mind when he gave him this name, you know. And these are sometimes leftists, you know, supposed to be revolutionaries. Now, if they were talking about some Marxists, and note you, I'm not against Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm not against Marxism. I keep saying this because anyone that wants to overthrow the state and equitably distribute the wealth, I'm for that. I'm not in your system because it's Aryan, but if you're about change, good for you. So I don't knock it. And the system's all about going against the left. So I'm not opposed to the left. But so they'll say, well, you know, Amilcar Cabral's father, he just picked this name. You know, Amilcar didn't mean anything. Well, what did it mean? It was taken from Hamilcar. Hamilcar. Hamilcar was the father of Hannibal. Uh-oh. Probably the greatest warrior in the history of the world. The man who led the Second Punic War against Rome. The man who crossed the Alps. The man that defeated Rome in every battle he fought. You hear me? He picked Hamilcar. Huh? I don't think that was an accident. First of all, to pick it, it meant that he had done some study. He knew who Hamilcar was. And it's interesting because my wife is often pointing this out. Africans always name you according to your character, your qualities. Usually in traditional Africa, a priest will come and determine what they are because you're not going to know in the beginning, except sometimes mothers can feel this in the womb. And so, as my wife often says, you got to be very careful what the name you give to your children is because it's going to affect them. And so if you give them a name of something that's great, and particularly if it is an extension of their character, it's going to encourage them to fulfill that. And so is it a coincidence that Amilcar, who's named after Hamilcar, would do something very similar that Hamilcar did? He, in his case, extended his father's war, which had been led in the First Punic War against Rome, in the Second Punic War. Is it an accident that Amilcar Cabral would end up being a person who put his neck on the line to lead an effective, successful armed struggle against the Portuguese with his people under his leadership and the leadership of people he trained, kicking their behind out of Guinea-Bissau? Is that an accident? I don't think so. you know. So those of you that want to dismiss this, you go right ahead and dismiss it. I don't think that there's anything that's an accident. You hear me? So who was Amilcar Cabral's father? He already knew to name him, give him a good name. Who was he? Both Amilcar Cabral's father and mother were Cape Verdeans. And that's important. But as I pointed out, Amilcar Cabral was born in Guinea-Bissau of Cape Verdean parents. So the first thing is to understand the influence of the father. Normally you start with the mother, but because of the influence of the father, it was so central, I'm going to start here first. Amilcar Cabral's father was called Juvenal Cabral. His mother was Iva Penhel Imora. Juvenal Cabral was the most singular important influence on Amilcar Cabral in his whole life. And that's clear from the way in which he approached life, which was similar to the way the father did or views of the father. So the father had a tremendous influence on his son, both in naming him, but particularly in his approach to life. Juvenal Cabral, he came from Cape Verde, but he was a critic of the policies of the Portuguese. And he particularly opposed the divide and conquer policies of the Portuguese, where they tried to separate the people of Cape Verde from Guinea-Bissau. He was an advocate of the need for the people of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau to unite. This would become a central idea of Amilcar Cabral, not one that everyone in Guinea-Bissau liked, and definitely not one that a lot of Cape Verdes liked. But the fact is, he saw that the Cape Verde was a product of Guinea, but they had been heavily assimilated, spoke Portuguese. Many of them were well educated and were, as I said before, low-level administrators in Portuguese colonialism, because the Portuguese, not having raw resources to rip off in Guinea-Bissau, left the administration to others. So he was an advocate of the unity of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. His father was also a rigorous critical thinker, and he liked writing, and he excelled in university education, and in fact went to university education, Portuguese university education, to be a priest, discovering that that wasn't his calling. He was an outspoken person. He had a temper. He was someone who would fight, and in fact got thrown out of university because of a fight he had, and his willingness to submit to a beating, because had he been willing to accept a beating by the Portuguese person that was running the school, they would have allowed him to come back in. But his strong spirit of resistance said, hell no. That also put him in a poverty trap, because then he would not be able to get the kind of job that would provide a more comfortable life for his family. So Cabral also inherited these critical thinking qualities, and he was especially good at excelling in university education, which Cabral would do as well. He was also a poet, and Cabral was a poet. And in fact, Cabral's poetry in his early ages revealed his consciousness. I'll go into that in a minute. And his father loved African people. There's been some revised biographies on Cabral that has stressed some other features of the father, but fails to stress this feature. He loved African people. And this was a key feature of Amilcar Cabral. So these were some of the influences that Juvenal Cabral had on Amilcar Cabral. In terms of his education, the biggest influence was because he was a critic of this one crop economy system developed by the Portuguese in Guinea and Cape Verde. And so he favored diversifying the agriculture. He encouraged Amilcar Cabral to be an agronomist. And that is the degree he went after in Portugal, a very difficult degree to achieve. An agronomist is a person who specializes in agriculture. Almost everybody in his class in the university in Portugal flunked out. And Cabral was at the top. I don't know if he was the top person, but was one of the top people in his class. And he had gifts in mathematics and science as well. So this was the influence of the father. And it's always important to understand family influences. And I always try and do that in anything I'm looking at. And that's a part of our culture as well. But it's a part of what shapes you. Now, Amilcar Cabral's mother, she was a woman who had a hard life, particularly after the mother and father divorced. And so she is left with the task of taking care of Amilcar Cabral. And it meant that they lived in poverty. It was very hard life for them. And so one of the things that was key that Cabral experienced was hunger, but he experienced the determination of his mother to keep him alive. And through whatever scrap of a job she could get, she fed him. But the main thing she contributed to Amilcar Cabral is she is the one that saw that Amilcar Cabral was able to take advantages in the Portuguese educational system, where when he was young, they were beginning to open up education where promising students could get a free education. And she was the one pushing that. Without that, even though the father had the encouragement and stuff, it was the mother that saw that Amilcar Cabral could realize the opportunity to achieve an education that would give them the skills necessary for a country in Africa, because the economy of Africa is agricultural. It's not a better subject that you could major in than agronomy or agriculture. And this is where, though Julius Nyerere did not major in agriculture because he came out of an Ujamaa village or a village culture that based on communalism, he had a value for agriculture. And so that meant that he would have some ideas on how to best advance his country, because too many African countries, they come out of independence self-sufficient in food. But under both mismanagement of African leadership and the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and others who are operating on the behest of the United States especially, they're able to put Africa into a level of poverty that exceeded what they had at independence. So Cabral, while he's influenced by the father to pursue agronomy, it's his mother that guarantees that he has a chance to get an education. She is the one that is seeing to that. So this is key in terms of understanding Iva Penhel Evora's influence on Amilcar Cabral. It was a central influence. And Cabral was a person who respected African women. And in his leadership, this is central to his leadership. He didn't share this arrogance towards the people, which is generally manifested in arrogance towards African women. Malcolm X had a saying. He said, you can measure a level of a people, in this case, African people, by the level of African women. And I think that you could say that if you're going to be a leader and you're going to serve your people, then you have to have the highest respect for African women because they're the source of your later life. They're the source of your wisdom. We don't call it father wit, we call it mother wit. Real wisdom comes from the mother. And for African people, the level of the people is determined by the level of our women. And Cabral had the deepest respect for African women. Now, when we had the interview with Ana Maria Cabral, who was one lovely, beautiful, brilliant, brave sister, we'll go into that more. And I'm going to focus on that somewhat here. I don't want to step on the topic for next week, but I want to say that was central to Cabral being a revolutionary, was his appreciation of love and respect for African people, but especially African women. And this is the heart and soul of his revolutionary project. And you won't see in the West this being raised as a revolutionary principle. You know, I come out of this philosophy, all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Cabral manifested that. He didn't know about this discovery that I made through God's light, that the Twa gave birth to that, but he would run into it in the most radical form among a traditional people in Guinea-Bissau. And they were as much responsible for the success of the revolution in Guinea-Bissau as Cabral's thoughts were, and the fighting spirit and brilliance of the people who were engaged in the armed struggle under the leadership of the PAIGC. So there are some key things that I'm going to deal with today around Cabral's thought and how it applies in the global arena among Africans in the US, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans on the continent, Africans in the diaspora. And this applies to people of color, by the way. So I'm going to be dealing with the way in which transformation worked. Because when your mind has become colonized, or in the United States enslaved and then colonized, or in the Caribbean enslaved and colonized, then there has to be a path for freeing it. And so there's going to be an emphasis on the role in which the freedom of the mind played as an expression of African culture. What was that role? And we're going to see how this had global connections. This is real important. We're also going to be looking at, in the process of organizing in the liberation movement, what was the role of understanding how a society was organized? That's called social structure. And in fact, the philosophy of all people emerged from social structure. Generally, social structure is first referring to family structures. And then the way in which a society is organized, growing out of family structures. It's interesting that Marx ignored the family, except in Engels' work, The State, the Family, and Private Property. I read all of Marx, by the way, and I ain't no Marxist, you know. So you revolutionary, how you leave the family out? And that would also leave out your questioning of patriarchy. You could analyze capitalism, which is good. Marx did a good analysis on capitalism, at least industrial capitalism. But if you fail to explain how is it that what you call the means of production, the ownership and control of what was then factory production and now computerized production and every other kind ends up in the hands of men, white men in particular, based on ripping our blood off through slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. So how you leave that out? Is that cultural bias, your expression, your so-called liberation theory be an expression of culture? Were you blindsided? And Marx was Jewish, and he was in rebellion, rightfully so, against Judaism. So he wasn't religious, and I'm not critical of him for that. I wouldn't be either if I was him. I ain't going to get too much out of that when it comes to revolution. So I understand that, Marx. But don't be telling me that the spirit systems of Africa are the opiates of the masses, or the spirit systems of Native Americans was the opiate of the masses, or the Lao Tzu system of China, which is a spirit system not embraced by most Chinese. They embraced Confucianism, but some of them did. How is that an opiate? I agree. That stuff that you got, from Constantine, that's an opiate. And you make a mistake if you think that what blacks dropped in what they call black Christianity was an opiate. No, it wasn't. It was the key to blacks getting their act together here. And the most beautiful stuff we developed in this country came out of that. I'm no Christian. I was a nominal one at one point. Was dunked in the water at 3 or 4 years old at Third Baptist. The only thing I remember at that age, nearly being drowned to death, But I love that holiness church. Why? It was Africa. It was the spirit of Africa. You hear me? And yeah, some things have been done wrong with the black church. But as Ella Baker said, the aesthetics of the black community come out of the black church. If you're going to be a singer, it would help if you were in the holiness church. If you had some James Cleveland in you, some Thomas Dorsey in you. You had some blues up in there in the gospel thing. You hear me? James Brown couldn't do what he did without that. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Hey, James Brown had the holiness spirit in him. You see those dances he did? Where you think that came from? It came from his own talent, but those are the dances of the holiness church. When the spirit is being brought down, you got to cross the legs in the right way. You hear me? And that's where Michael Jackson got his moonwalk and all the rest of that stuff. Liberation movement's an act of culture. Malcolm made a mistake when he said, ain't no movement that's singing is about anything. It's got to be about swinging. And I've corrected him before on this. When we sing, we swing. Muhammad Ali, was, as a poem he said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Muhammad Ali, he didn't come up with that. One of his trainers did. It was sent to him by Sugar Ray Robinson, the greatest boxer of ever, who was grace in motion, and Muhammad Ali based his stuff on that. You hear me? That was a dance in motion. When he hit you with the jab, it was pretty hard and pretty fast. In fact, you had to have a slow motion camera to see it. He could knock you out with a jab. I don't know if he ever did, but he had the power in a jab. So this spirit is like key. And when we're talking about African culture and the liberation movements and expression of culture, at heart, there's the spirit in it. So we're going to be talking about transformational process. We're going to be talking about how in the organizational process, social structure is important. And we're going to be talking about the way in which traditional cultures held on to certain things that enabled the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau to move forward. And in fact, was central to the strategy, the guerrilla strategy used, the hit and run strategy used by the PAIGC. So this is kind of like an overview of this. So one of the things that I noted in the PR that was put out on this show was a quote from Amilcar Cabral, where he said, one of the biggest mistakes of the colonial powers in Africa was to either ignore or underestimate the cultural strengths of African people. One of the biggest mistakes of the colonial powers in Africa was to either ignore or underestimate the cultural strengths of African people. What do you mean by that? And this was a general problem for the colonial powers all over Africa and the semi-colonial powers in the United States. What do you mean? Based on racism, they assumed that the African was not only inferior, but was not a human being. And therefore, the only thing that could be worthy for an African was to aspire to be a European. And so they dismissed this culture. But it was this culture in the case of Guinea-Bissau, but across Africa, that fiercely fought colonialism. And it was the beliefs instilled in African people through African culture that enabled them to do that. And while Cabral did not study the cultural unities of African culture, it was the unities of African culture that led to broad resistance across the African continent. There was 100 years of resistance to the intrusion of Africans into Africa, military resistance. And these were by the old Africans who came out of the traditional societies of either kings and queens or classless age grade societies. And so their underestimation of African culture was based on their denial of the humanity of African people. A big mistake, because you see, the first rule in war is to know your enemy. And since they made us their enemy, and we were opposed to them, if they wanted to keep a hold on us, they at least had a better chance if they knew what they were going up against. And that's always been the case. In my experience in battles, the underestimation of us has always been a weakness, which I haven't particularly liked, because I would like to beat you with you knowing every strength I got so I can just clean your clock even better. But if you're going to give me wiggle room, I'm taking it. You dumb enough to underestimate the people you going up against, fine with me. You know what I mean? But the point is, this was an underestimation that led the colonizers to assume that the best way to control the African, and this is true of other people of color as well, was through assimilation. And assimilation is this process where you lead a people to take on the culture of the oppressor. And so with Native Americans, after they exterminated 90% of them, the ones who were left, they're taking their children away from this, United States and Canada in particular, and sticking them in boarding schools and doing everything to wipe out their language, to dress them in European clothes, and to make them useless to their people. So it's the assimilation policies of the Portuguese in particular that was a real problem in the liberation movement. Now, in the case of Guinea-Bissau, assimilation was so negligible that out of a population in 1950 of 502,457, 502,457 Guinea-Bissauans, only 1,478 were assimilated. And how did they define assimilation? You had to be 18 years of age or older. You had to speak Portuguese. You had to have an income of a certain amount. You had to be able to pay taxes. And you had to have a level of Portuguese miseducation that they called education. And that's how you would learn to speak Portuguese. So out of 500,000, 1,478 Guinea-Bissauans were actually assimilated. So this this was a success of their assimilation policy. However, among the Cape Verdes, virtually all of them were. Not all of them were university educated, but they could speak Portuguese. And they spoke Creole, which was their language, which is what we would call Ebonics, a Niger-Congo Bantu linguistic system, which was one of the two languages spoken by the Haitians. When you go back to the show that I did on the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint spoke the language of his people coming from Ghana, and he also spoke Creole. And by the way, the people of Cape Verde were inspired, as we were in the Western Hemisphere and other Africans in different parts of the world, by the Haitian Revolution. And it was a part of a process of de-assimilation when you identified with a people who were rising up, leading the only successful revolution against slavery, slitting the throats of their masters effectively and catching hell to this day. And I want to say that in the Western Hemisphere, they are the strongest Africans. We're second strongest in terms of the culture, but then the Jamaicans are strong. The Caribbean people are strong. But of all of them, it's the Afro-Haitians. That's the Haitians who are the strongest. Why? Because they're the only people to bust slavery in the history of the world. They're defeated. The only people. But they continue to fight. And it's the U.S. and its allies who keep them in the dust. That it's our responsibility to put the Haitians on the top of our agenda when we're talking about supporting African people. Support the Haitian people. Because everything the U.S. is doing, whether it's under the Biden administration, whether it was under the Obama administration, whether it's under the Trump administration, I don't care what administration it was, it is anti-Haitian. Over 25,000 Haitians have been deported under this administration. While if you come from Ukraine, you're automatically given a place to stay. Of course, it's Europe that's doing most of the assimilation of the Ukrainians, at least temporarily. So Cabral ends up in Portugal going for European education. And it is at a time where two significant events historically take place. One is the Fifth Pan-African Congress held in Manchester in 1945, where George Padmore, real name Malcolm Nurse, who was from Trinidad, with the assistance of Kwame Nkrumah, organized the most effective movement among Africans in the 20th century for African liberation. And Nkrumah is able to apprentice under George Padmore. That was his code name when he was working as the highest ranking African in the Russian Bureau. He was a colonel in Russia. He broke with the Russians over the issue of the Russians downplaying African independence during World War II because they wanted everyone to get into a united front against Germany, which had invaded their country. And the nationalism of George Padmore led him to say no, and he left the Soviet Union. He wrote a book called Pan-Africanism or Communism. You should read it. He was a major influence on Nkrumah. So when Cabral is going to Portugal, he's going at a time where Africans are beginning to plot the independence of Africa under a notion that comes from enslaved Africans in the U.S., the Caribbean, especially Trinidad, of Pan-Africanism, or one Africa. And I hear ignorant people, Black people, on the internet talking against Pan-Africanism. Huh? What kind of foolishness is this? You're talking about Africans uniting because some right-wingers have infected you with the idea that the only Africans that are worthy of getting some reparations in this country are Africans of birth from here. What's an African of birth from here? They came on boats. If you want to talk about the leadership of the greatest armed struggle during slavery, Denmark Vesey, where did he come from? He came from a boat from slavery in Haiti, and he won a lottery that got him free. And it was a combination of this Afro-Haitian presence, because he was in Haiti and saw this revolution. That's what inspired him to lead the revolution in South Carolina. And then he had a guy named Gula Jack from Angola. I mean, where do you think we came from? You know? The good ship, Jesus brought the first ones over here, and that was for, England and their slave trade. But we didn't come on the Mayflower, It's all this knucklehead stuff. So Cabral, he was inspired by that. That was in the clouds. That was a part of what influenced the thinking of young Africans now in Europe, in this case in Portugal. The other thing that influenced him was the Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill and others. And what did it call for? It called for the self-determination of the colonized people of the world. So there is an atmosphere of liberation going on. Now, of course, the Americans were speaking out of two sides of their mouth. Roosevelt was against the old colonialism of Britain, France, and the others. But he was for a new colonialism that would occur through Bretton Woods, set of agreements where they create the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. It would become a financial colonialism led by the U.S. But the point is, at this time, even the Western powers, to do whatever they can to defeat Nazi Germany, they want to rally as many people on their side as possible, including Africans who fought on the side of the U.S. during, Britain and France during World War II, and Blacks who went and fought during World War II on the side of the U.S. My father was not one of them. I told you this before. He went before the draft board and told them, "Hey, no Germans or Japanese look anything like me. In fact, the Japanese look a little bit like me. The Germans, they ain't lynched none of my men or raped any of my women." And he said, "Give me a gun, I'll shoot every redneck cracker I can get my sights on." And he got a 4F. You hear me? Some of our people said, they ain't going to be fighting to make the world safe for democracy. That was the slogan in World War I, and fight to free the world of Nazism, when Hitler was basing his system on a far more effective system of segregation, genocide, and brain experiments and everything else in the United States than he could ever carry out. I mean, my father knew that, and he had no education. That was the best education, because he educated himself, So Cabral, when he comes to Portugal for an education, he's in the assimilation stage of consciousness. Coming from Cape Verde, he can speak Portuguese. He has excelled in their educational system enough to get a scholarship to come to Portugal for an education. And so he's assimilated. So this is the first thing I want to deal with, is the process for freeing Cabral's mind. This was an organic process that was experienced by Africans throughout the world in need of that transformation. So Cabral is known by many of the leaders of Angola and Mozambique who took part with him in a study group that was disguised as a cultural group, because they were up under Portuguese fascism. And so anything that looked too political could get you thrown in jail, tortured, and definitely thrown out of university and sent back home, if you were lucky enough to get sent back home, lucky enough to live. And so under cultural groups, they had discussions And Cabral is viewed as the leader of this group. And they began to read books and articles written under Présence Africaine, which was a publication coming out of Paris of Francophone Africans, that is, Africans who spoke French in the French colonies, and then some from the Caribbean. And this was writings about African history, African culture, African poetry. It was under the Negritude movement of Leopold Senghor, who became president of Senegal later. And so Cabral describes his transformation. He said, for the first time, he learned about the great history of the Africans in America, the Africans in the Caribbean, the Africans in Africa. He learned the beauty of Africa, and he was in the first stage of awakening. He was undergoing what Cabral called mental conversion. And so his first stage, his transformation, was based on study of African history, African culture, African politics, and especially African art. And Cabral, as I pointed out, was a poet. And so the love of Africa was something that arose in him. Now, his father and mother had instilled certain values in him, but this was the real transformation. Cabral called this experience mental conversion. He said, we decided to become Africans, meaning they had been assimilated into the Portuguese mindset. And part of what woke Cabral up was his disturbance because of part, and this is the sixfold stages that we're encouraging people to get into in this show. It's the same thing. Cabral began to understand what assimilation meant. It meant that if you took on this Portuguese identification, it was an identification of hatred for your own people. It was identification of arrogance towards your own people, and therefore it was internalized self-hatred. And so it was seeing what assimilation really meant firsthand, being in the capital of Portuguese colonialism, where he experienced anger over the process that he was going through, because he could see he was being miseducated to become a flunky for Portuguese colonialism, as were the other Africans who were there. And so in beginning to study African history, culture, and his past, he was beginning to de-assimilate and to embrace African identity. Cabral would also make the point that this process, and this is a point I'd make for the process that we've gone through here, this process of mental freedom or mental conversion would only be complete when those who embraced African identity joined the struggle for African liberation. And the same is true here. So, first thing we're looking at is the role that culture played in the transformation, not only just of Cabral, but those who had been assimilated. And we'll see that Malcolm X underwent this same conversion. I underwent this same conversion. I wasn't following Cabral. I didn't know about Cabral until well after my awakening, which was in 1963. Malcolm's transformation occurred in prison. All three of us shared the experience of assimilation. And in this case, for me, psychological assimilation, historical assimilation. And so I call this the sixfold stages to mental freedom, because it charts the stages through which our people go when they undergo an awakening. Cabral called it mental conversion. Malcolm X had not really been able to stand back from this experience because he was busy organizing and whatnot. So he wasn't able to trace the stages through which he went. But he, as I pointed out before, described this in terms of his experience. So he said, first, your philosophy changes from a European Aryan philosophy of contempt for your people, for yourself, from a Supreme Court Justice Thomas mentality of hating yourself because, as he said, your behind had been kicked by Europeans, to a philosophy of self-love, self-knowledge, and self-respect. And he said, then your attitude changes from negative to positive. And then he said, because he's describing, see, this is all about a transformation of mind, body, and spirit. So this is an experience he's describing. He said, then when your attitude changes from negative to positive, your thought pattern changes, beginning to think for yourself as opposed to your mind being on remote control. And then he said, when your thought pattern changes, your communication pattern changes. And I pointed this out before. Minister Louis Farrakhan, in his interaction with Malcolm, said he never heard Malcolm make a negative comment about Black people, let alone Black women. Never. Because his thought pattern had changed. See, this whole debate about should we use the N-word or not, that only occurs among people who haven't had the shift of consciousness, the awakening. Because when you've undergone the awakening, you discard that. When you've undergone the awakening, you have freed yourself from a lot of the things that, we call now post-traumatic slave syndrome, and what is now the post-68 complex that I call a choice between two cultures, where we're stepping out of our culture now in ways we never have before. Some of us have become more Aryan than the Aryan. We're getting more pleasure at killing people than even they do. Because when we go to extremes, we really go to extremes. Have you noticed it? Huh? The behavior of some of our people who are supposed to be artists, appearing in public naked, proud of it, showing their pictures up on Facebook and whatnot. You know what I mean? That's for your man to see. You don't even want your children seeing you naked. Why do you want the world to see you naked? You know what I mean? Huh? And then we internationalize the N-word. Got Chinese using it. Mexicans using it. And then we run around being angry when white people use it. And we're using it as we're saying a sign of affection. As they say, show me the meat, show me the love. If this is producing so much love, show me where it is. You know what I mean? It definitely ain't coming from people who are mouthing hate and talking about his love. So Amilcar Cabral's experience of freeing the mind is the same experience that we had in this country. Malcolm underwent it, I did, others in the movement. And the key was that in embracing an image of ourselves that was positive, a historical image, then we could embrace both an image of Africa that was positive, an image of Afro-America, wherever we were in the world. We could embrace an image of ourselves that was positive, because largely self-hatred is based on a false image of Africa, not Africa. It's the picture, the Tarzan picture that whites have created. So it's the transformation of image, but it is only complete the transformation, when you're involved in a battle to free your behind. The freedom of the mind is the key to the freedom of your behind. And that was the key point that Cabral made. Cabral's awakening begins through study. My awakening began in battle, in which carriers of everyday culture opened my mind up, in this case, in the name of my good friend Norman Brown, who came from the same town that Zora Neale Hurston came from. Didn't see a white person until he was 18 years of age. Norman was thinking for himself. Here I am, second year of law school, thinking I'm thinking for myself, and my mind is on remote control. So it was the battle that opened my mind up and then led me to hit the books so that I could be successful in confronting my enemies. Malcolm's was in prison, where because of his study of African and African American history and European and everything else, he said he had the first experiences of mental freedom in confinement. So the key point is that in the process of the colonizer, and in this case, the enslaver and colonizer here, having a disrespect for the culture of African people, and on a certain sector of Africans imposing assimilation, the process for freedom itself did not emerge from Africa. That process emerged from the organic nature of what happens when you free yourself from the shackles of slavery or colonialism that's imposed on your mind. When you free yourself from those shackles, there are stages that you go through. You'll only know them when you go through them. And you can tell those blacks who are out there calling themselves leaders whether they've gone through it or not, because it will be determined by what comes out of their mouth and what they end up doing. So this also explains then why Amilcar Cabral said that the liberation movement was an act of culture. The main reason is that, and this is why Cabral's uniqueness in framing his political ideas were framed in a cultural framework, because culture deals with every phase of life. It's your way of life and design for living that covers everything. But he would focus in on culture. Why? Because the freedom of the mind occurred through returning not just to African culture, but to the positive aspects of African culture. Not just to African American culture, but to the positive aspects of African American culture. And so, just as he said, the act of the colonizer in suppressing colonized Africans was an act of cultural suppression. Therefore, the liberation movement is an act of resistance against that cultural oppression, which is in every area of life. And so this is why Cabral's central emphasis is on culture. Now, Cabral didn't study in detail different African cultures. He wasn't into what we're into now, the Kemetic thing. He was dealing with the realities coming out of his own cultural experience in Guinea-Bissau and the awakening that occurs among a Cape Verde person. But it was the overall, overarching nature of African culture that he was drawing from and inspired by. And so the freedom of the mind can only occur when you immerse yourself in the deep waters of African and African American culture. Those who are only interested in Kemet, not the rest of Africa, those who are only interested in Kemet and not Afro-America, they will not free their minds. Because first of all, in order to free your mind, you need to draw from the best of your past, both African and African American, or African and Caribbean, or wherever you are in the world. And you must internalize that within the context of the culture in the world in which you live. because that's the only way you can free your mind. It's an internalization process. It's a way you put food into your system, you digest it, and the part that you need, you keep, the rest you throw out. And that is the nature of this internalization process. And so Cabral would describe the liberation movement as an act of culture because in drawing from the best features of African culture, when you do, you have a deep sense of self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love. That enables you to love yourself. And when you can love yourself, you can love your people. My wife's father had a saying, Black people love God more than themselves, meaning they don't love God. Because if you don't love yourself, how can you love God? And God's a part of you. How do you do that? You can't, And so self-love is the key to everything, baby. Internal peace, internal harmony, creativity, everything. You could never be alone when you love yourself. You hear me? So Cabral's grounding in the positive features of African culture led to something else, which is a common feature of African culture. Many Western thinkers, and these are leftist thinkers, these are Marxists, they like Cabral, but they like him when they can put him in their framework. They want to say he was a Marxist, which he was not, though he used some Marxist terminology in his language. He talked about mode of production and stuff like that. But he was critical of some Marxist thought. He was critical of almost everything because that's what creative people are. But their real problem with understanding Cabral is coming out of a different African framework of thought. And this framework of thought is a common framework found throughout the African world. Again, I'm using Cabral to look at African culture, and in this case, the culture of resistance in general. So they think, and by the way, many of these leftist thinkers don't think Cabral was original. I've read some of their writings, I read all of them. I got a huge number of books here on Cabral. By the way, Cabral is the subject. He's one of the 6 masters that I'm studying in the book on Seba, To Know the Truth is to Be the Truth, which is the replacement system for teaching, taking the place of the Western banking system that just deposits information and you regurgitate it. In fact, I'm back on polishing this book. It's at 671 pages, and I'm getting ready to get on Cabral. Cabral is one of the 6 masters. And so this discussion has also been good in just tightening me up further on that. And so one of the things that I found that's very important in understanding Cabral's thought is how he thought, and it was in an African frame of reference. I don't even know if he thought that's what it was, but that's what it was. He did describe himself as a situational thinker. Ella Baker is one of the other masters I use in this book that I'm finishing, and I describe her as a situational revolutionary thinker, and Cabral was a revolutionary as well. This is a form of thought special to African thinking. Now, one reason why Western scholars, particularly Marxists, but others as well, will try and dismiss Cabral is because they are not situational thinkers. They are thinkers who think in writing, and they're scripted, mechanical thinkers. And in fact, if you want to look at that and understand what that means, if you look at, for example, Black musicians, first of all, Black music is about the music of situations. What you're doing is the blues is about the situation where the Black man is in the situation where his woman's left him. Or in one sad blues song, I wouldn't have even written this song, the brother is calling up his wife's lover who's wearing his clothes or driving his car to ask him, what is it that you got that I didn't have? You gonna ask him? But it's a situation, and that's one sad situation. You know what I mean? Or it's a sister, who is talking about, I don't care how much you bring home and everything else. As Aretha would say, it's respect. RESPECT. The man is usually about the situation of what he's done for you. And part of it is he's giving you a house, he's giving you a car, he's giving you this. But the sister is saying, well, sometimes that ain't enough. But it's the situation. And that's why this music is so appealing, because it's dealing with the situations of males and females. Whereas if you look at European music, like classical music, it's a mechanical scripted music. And in fact, music reveals the soul of a people. That's one of my specialties, African American music, And so their stuff is scripted, and it ain't got anything to do necessarily with the situations of life. It's a theory of something. And so some opera singer singing in a language you can't understand is singing this. And it's also an aristocratic music created by the aristocrats for them. That's why so few people go and see it, And yeah, I know Beethoven was black and everything else. And I don't knock blacks who are into this. It's the nature of being raised in an environment like this. But the key point is, by situational thinker, Cabral was drawing from a hieroglyphic form of thought, a meta-nature system of thought that Zora Neale Hurston beautifully described. She said, blacks think, and this is true for Africans, hieroglyphically. Europeans think in writing. Now, some of our jazz musicians write their music out. Some of them. They certainly know, a lot of them know musical notation. Some of them did not, and some still don't, but most do. But the art form is one in which, as Miles did when he went into a recording studio, he said, start with what you know and then go beyond yourself. And so Kind of Blue, which is one of the greatest creations in jazz, Miles went into the studio with Coltrane and a number of other musicians and just had a few notes. And out of that created one of the most lyrically beautiful pieces of music in the history of the world. Why? Because he rose above himself. It was the situation where he had a bunch of creative musicians, and on the spot, they went inside their soul and came up with something new. I do that on every show. I will lay out some basic stuff, but I'm going beyond that. And that's what I do in the battlefield. We have an enemy we got to take out, and, got a little idea of their weaknesses and strengths, but then you rise above yourself in the battlefield. And what you do is you come up with new stuff. You hit him from the left, you hit him from the right, and he falls and you don't even know what happened. That's what good strategy is. Because the art of strategy is to win without a fight. The majority of my victories have been without a fight. Strategy, baby. It's called power. And you run around here acting like you haven't got any, So the thing is, when we're looking at Cabral's thoughts were among the most accurate laid out by any revolutionary thinker, because they came out of situations. Cabral's thoughts were based on the experiences he had in organizing. And so his thoughts mirrored that. He didn't go beyond the experience. And so as a result, when he hit you, that hitting led to results. And so the Marxists, Lenin, who was a great thinker, by the way, wrote a huge number of books and stuff. He described the revolutionary movement as one in which it was guided by a revolutionary theory. If you didn't have a revolutionary theory, you didn't have a revolutionary movement. Technically, that would mean that the Cubans didn't have a revolution because, frankly, Castro was no theoretician. He was, in fact, following Antonio Maceo, who led the revolt against slavery, and then Jose Marti, who was president. But it was Antonio Maceo who was the strategist, and Castro was following the strategy of Antonio Maceo. He didn't have a revolutionary theory, you know. And Batista ran out and he took power, you know. Now, that ain't the way it normally works, but that worked for them. And, you know, Lenin had all these theories, but basically they came to power. Julius Nyerere and I, when we met in 1967, we had a long discussion on this, and Nyerere made the comment that the Russians came to power in a coup d'etat, but they had the nerve to say the Chinese didn't have a revolution. Now they're the second strongest power in the world, you know. So Amilcar Cabral's theory came from his practice, and it came from guiding principles of African culture, the most important of which was humanism. Cabral required that his soldiers not kill children, not kill women, and if they were civilians, not kill elders. Of course, if it's a general, kill them. The Portuguese policy was, as the white boys' policies is, everywhere, kill everybody. But it was his humanism, and his humanism was especially expressed through the casualties of his own people. He considered the death of any more than 2 of his soldiers a catastrophe. So he had a very low casualty rate. And this, again, was because in his situational thinking, Cabral was out to win with a minimum of losses on his side, and he inflicted heavy casualty rates on the other side. So situational thinking was thinking that was field tested. And so you know that it worked. Ella Baker's thinking was situational. The book I'm finishing, I've done the chapter because the chapter I'm working on now is Boloso, the improvisational stage in mastery. And so I went through Ella Baker's thinking, and my conclusion was Ella Baker was a situational revolutionary thinker whose ideas came out of her practice, starting with her practice in North Carolina, where she was raised in an all-Black community, predominantly Black, where a grandfather owned a large number of acres of land and distributed it to family members and took apart and built a church and built a school on it, and where sharing was common in the community. And so she was trying to reproduce the life situation, the situation of her childhood in her organizing. And she had added to her family's experience, which was supportive of Black freedom at that time, she added the belief that the masses of Black people were capable of freeing themselves. And so she formulated out of situational thinking this idea that the group could free itself, group-centered leadership. That idea grew out of hunter-gatherer and classless age-grade societies, which I've covered in this show. The show's on the Igbo that not that many people have watched. You need to watch it. You think the only thing that great was Kemet. The freest societies that were freer than the Kemites, other than the ancient period of 10,000 BC before the pharaohs, were these smaller societies in which the people ruled directly. And that was what she was drawing from. Whether she knew it or not, that was the roots of her group-centered system, which was a system of male-female empowerment. And Ella Baker was definitely an empowered Black female. When the sheriff's son called her the N-word, she knocked him out. And her family didn't go and say, oh, what was me? White supremacy. Why'd you do this? You could get lynched. They patted her on the head and said, right on, Ella. Ella never believed in nonviolence. She was pugnacious. A lady, too, in every sense of the word. By the way, she was an embodiment of Black womanhood. Not false frailty, which is white womanhood. Fake frailty. You got to see that in the park, where that brother had this woman calling in on him. He had told her to lease her dog, and she calls in, and when you hear how she's faking, oh, this man is threatening me, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? False frailty. That's caused by thousands of years of patriarchy, where you're put to the side and useless. The Black woman doesn't have a problem of frailty. Now, I have a very good friend, my first wife's cousin, Shirley. She's a very thin woman, physically frail looking, She's a Leo. She runs the family, you know what I mean? She is one strong powerhouse. She says, I may look frail, but don't confuse the looks with the reality. My wife said pretty much the same thing when I met her, because she's kind of short and everything and beautiful. And she said, don't confuse this now, This is a woman who's got a lot of strength, in this case, internally, morally, spiritually, and up to a point physically. But the point is, the African woman can twitch, you know what I mean? She knows how to walk, but at the same time is strong. Her femininity is strong femininity. I don't care what kind you're talking about. But Ella Baker's thinking was situational. And so she offered ideas on how Blacks could build power based on situation. It made it very hard for the CIA and FBI to clock her thinking, because it wasn't a laid out set of theories. It was a set of things that worked. But it's not pragmatism. That's a mistake to call it that, because American pragmatism that arises out of a theological system of utility or usefulness has no values attached to it. And it isn't really about ideas that work, contrary to what you think. Samuel Pierce, who's the author of this, was a statistician. And his idea was it was the mean, that is the average of something, that was the truth. He wasn't looking for the truth. What do you mean? You're going to average out the thinking of slave masters, huh? And that would be the truth. That's basically what your Supreme Court does. They're teleological. And you're finding out now with the Supreme Court, they're focusing on Clarence Thomas and all the trips he's got and everything else, how the rich have rewarded him and put his nephews and stuff through college. And he's a part of a society that rewards people who have climbed up. Oprah's in it. I don't put Oprah down because she's not behind this philosophy, but she's in it. And, these are people who have bought their votes on the Supreme Court. You hear me? Huh? Yeah, that's how the Supreme Court is. As Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, their decisions go to the most powerful forces in society. So the decision on student loans, the powerful forces, the bankers don't want it. So the little bit, the 10,000 or whatever that Biden wanted to forgive, they're saying no. But anything that's good for the rich or the right wing is fine for them. If we had waited on them to end slavery, we'd still have shackles around our wrists and legs. So don't confuse situational thinking with American pragmatism. Now let's look at Cabral's most important contribution to revolutionary thought. What makes him the best thinker produced in the 20th century among the world's leaders. In the Chinese Revolution, a big question was, what force would transform society in China? And a lot of the members of the Chinese Communist Party thought the working class would, because they were following Russia. And Chow Enlai, who ended up becoming foreign minister later, but was in charge of the party at that point, was an advocate of that until the Long March, which was a march where the Chinese were running away from the Kuomintang, which was led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, who was a gangster who was backed by the United States. So they were running across China to avoid Chiang Kai-shek wiping them out. Now, there's a whole other thing to this. I won't go into it. But the key point is, in the early part of this march, power shifts from Chiang Kai-shek to Mao Zedong. Why? Mao had the correct understanding of the social structure. What was it? That the peasants of China were the source of power. That wasn't all that brilliant. I mean, at that time, they had 400 or 500 million Chinese. Most of them were peasants. And they had histories of peasant rebellions. They brought down emperors, you know? So anyone who was thinking Chinese should have figured this out already. But still, he was right. And that was key to the success of that revolution. And Mao was the first to give land to the peasants. A big deal. He was made as a god because of that, whatever his shortcomings were. And he had a number of them. Remember, one of my specialties is China. You know what I mean? I study the world, baby. That's what strategists should do, you know? So his success, social structure. Cabral, Amilcar Cabral. The biggest contribution that Amilcar Cabral made in terms of thought was the thought on social structure. Social structure has to deal with, first of all, it starts with the family and the family structure and how that works. But generally, it's about how the society is organized. That's social structure. And in the case of the United States, that analysis had to be extremely complex because this is a multinational state with many different ethnic groups and blacks making up 50 or more million, dispersed across the country with a social structure of our own. So Cabral's greatest contribution in terms of revolutionary thought was in the area of social structure, and he provides the best analysis done by any scholar or any leader in the world, bar none. And it's an expression of his situational thinking. So Cabral was an agronomist, an African agronomist, of which the Portuguese had very few. And he was good at disguising what he was really doing. And so the Portuguese saw him as a skilled African, trained in agronomy and in agriculture, and so they could utilize him to study the agricultural system of Guinea-Bissau. Of course, they're going to use it to exploit the country. So Cabral agrees to do this. He had tried to get better jobs and couldn't get one in Portugal or anything else, but because he was black, so they get him this job. He is able to live in a nice house in Guinea-Bissau. His first wife was white, Portuguese, and she was an agronomy student that he helped get through agronomy school. She was one of a handful that graduated. And because he had a place to stay, he could bring his mother. He could bring family members so they'd have a roof over their head. So that was a good part of it. But the main thing is his task was to go into the villages and study the agricultural system. And he already had an overall idea of that study that had been shaped by his father, Juvenal Cabral, that the one-crop economy of Portugal was deadly for the Africans. And so he had that idea in general. So he traveled from one end of Guinea-Bissau to the other. His wife would not go into the villages, but would help him in terms of sorting the data later on. And so what he did is analyze the agricultural needs, and he had an implied criticism of Portuguese colonialism because they had promoted this one crop economy. And so the Fulanis, while it was one crop, rice was very strong, but they also produced groundnuts. And so groundnuts could be sold on the foreign exchange market. So he studied the Fulanis. He studied other African cultures, and particularly people called the Volanta, whose economy was solely rice. So on the surface, he was doing an agricultural survey. And this agricultural survey was the most thorough that had been done at that time. But in actuality, he was using this to study the social structure of Guinea-Bissau and to see how the different ethnic groups, the Fulante, for example, the Malinka, the Volanta, how they were organized. This was a key thing that he was looking at. And so the Fulani, they were organized as a Muslim group. They were Islamic. And they had also fought the Portuguese, but then once the Portuguese gained control, their leaders collaborated with the Portuguese. And so this was a real problem for the Fulani, is that they had leaders who were serving as mouthpieces for the oppressor. And then, so Cabral studied how they were organized, the Islamic societies. And then he studied the Mandinka and studied how they were organized. They were also Islamic. Sekou Touré, who was president then of Guinea, was a Mandinka. And his relative was Samurai Touré, who had fought the French in guerrilla struggle. And then you had the Mande also. So I studied these different groups. And it was this study of the social structure that enabled Cabral to provide the basis for organizing strategy for the liberation movement. And he was able to figure out which sectors would be most supportive of an appeal for an armed struggle and which sectors would be harder to organize. And he understood that the Fulani, the Mandinka, and the Mande would be harder to organize. But the Volante or the Volata would be easier. And the main reason was the Volante were a people who didn't have any kings. They came out of the classless age grade societies that I've studied on this show, like the Igbo. They are the earliest systems organized after hunter-gatherer. They were democratically run, though elders had the first say-so. Generally, in these societies, the people had the final say-so. But to get to the people, you had to get through the elders first. So Cabral knew that. And so when he did organizing training, that was around that. It was how to approach the people to get through the elders, to get to the people. So it was this social structure analysis that was key to his success. And it was because it was a situational analysis, analyzing each situation, each ethnic group, how it was organized. It would enable Cabral to do what none of the other armed struggles did, launch a general insurrection. Whereas in Angola, Mozambique, and most armed struggles, they start at the border because you're usually bringing in revolutionaries who are on the outside of the country. And Cabral was training those people in Guinea. that shared a border with Guinea-Bissau. So, and the Portuguese, that's what they expected. So they prepared for an uprising on the borders. They had their troops all stretched out. But when Cabral started his armed struggle, it was all over the country. It wasn't in one part. And he would send organizers who spoke the languages of different ethnic groups. That would be problematic later. But that's the only way they would be able to communicate, in the language of the people. That would be a problem later because some of them would only stick to their own region and would not want to fight anywhere else. Some of them displaced the traditional leadership there and became dictators, and Cabral would have to deal with that. I won't go into that today. But the key point is he had an effective analysis of social structure. Some of our groups that have had trouble didn't really spend time on this, and when they did, some of them made serious mistakes. The Black Panther Party, for all of its courage and brilliance, Huey Newton had a lot of brilliance, and so did a number of others. They made a cardinal mistake on social structure. They had read a little bit of Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, where Frantz Fanon, who was a great intellectual coming from Martinique, psychiatrist, and supported and was active in support of the armed struggle in Algeria, was a psychiatrist and treated a lot of Algerian revolutionaries. He wrote Wretched of the Earth, Studies in Dying Colonialism Towards the African Revolution, Black Skin, White Mask. Wretched of the Earth, which was like a Bible in the 60s. And they drew from Fanon's incorrect conclusion that the lumpen proletariat would be the leading force in a revolution. Now, what's the lumpen? The lumpen are criminals. Now, some of them are barely criminals, but, they might be doing some burglaries like Huey was doing every now and then becoming progressively more radical. Or they might be doing other things, pimps, Drug dealing wasn't high because there wasn't a lot of drugs in the Black community, dealing drugs, robbing banks, robbery, whatever, you know what I mean? And the Panthers, if you note the two shows that I did with Emory Douglas, who was Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, he gave the inside view on how the party handled groups like this because they saw them as the leading force in the struggle. He said, well, while they were doing Panther work, they couldn't engage in lumpen activity. They couldn't use drugs and blah, blah. But afterwards, they could. What kind of revolution is that? You can be a criminal part-time and engaged in the struggle the other time. Huh? What is that? Now understand there's a fine line between criminals. There are revolutionaries that rob banks to fund the revolution. Now that's a little different. But generally, if you're talking about a criminal lifestyle, you got a problem because Cabral didn't make that mistake. They knew that the lumpens served as informants for the Portuguese. The lumpens could be flipped in a minute because they would have a jacket on them. They would have some charge they could bring on them. So they're going to turn on you, We had one like that in our organization. And when the black cops came to me and told me, you're infiltrated, he was the only member we had that was a member of the Hunters Point. That ain't why he was a lumpen, because the Hunters Point not lumpen. They were just poor. A lot of people on welfare, the Black community. But it turned out that that's what he was. I don't know what they had on him. He didn't have too much in the brains department either. I wouldn't tell my own members that I would set up a trap and then catch them. And I've said this in previous shows, this guy's actually had the nerve to send me a letter and say he'd like to meet with me or talk to me because he's living in the South. And he's been talking about his radical activity in the movement. Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, this is a fundamental mistake, but the party had a problem. And a lot of other groups in the Black liberation movement had a problem. It was twofold. One, They didn't have a process for transforming assimilated people. They didn't have a process for transforming people who had criminal tendencies, because some of them can be transformed and others cannot. So that was the first problem. And that problem had to do with the fact that the leadership of the party, in this case, Huey, for example, had not completed his work in terms of studying African history and culture. He was undergoing a transformation, getting his literacy together because he couldn't read and write until the 12th grade. And he was in the Afro-American Association, which was the major group that produced some deep thinkers in the Bay Area, led by a guy named Donald Worden, later El Mansur. Maulana Karinga came out of this group. A whole host of heavyweights came out of this group. I've referred to them before. So he started his study of African history and African culture, but he was pulled between Stagger Lee, which is in the blues, he's called Stagger Lee Shot Billy. He was a little gangster. And Malcolm X. He was pulled in these two different directions. And so he didn't undergo the deep transformation. He underwent part of it. And that's what enabled him to have ideas for kicking the party off, along with Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale had a clearer kind of background in terms of the community and stuff, and was himself a very good organizer and a good speaker. So the party didn't have a process for transforming people, and most of our groups did not, and this was a real weakness. Malcolm in the Nation of Islam had it, but this wasn't generally Nation of Islam policy. The Nation did have a process for transforming people religiously, but Malcolm had gone through the sixfold stages of mental freedom. And so he had his ministers that he transformed. But again, that was not the main system used by the Nation of Islam, but they did have a transformational system. It was religious, and it had an effect. They were able to take gangsters and turn them around. They were able to do that. But most groups were not. And in the case of the Black Panther Party, an example of a lumpen that they should have never brought into the party was Eldridge Cleaver. I don't care if some people hearing this don't like hearing this. Eldridge was gifted, good speaker, good writer. He wrote the book Soul on Ice. His lawyer had been a lawyer for us in Core, Jewish lawyer named Beverly Axelrod, who got him out of prison, who he wanted to marry. But if you read Soul on Ice, you'd realize it was a rapist manual more than anything, that Eldridge had never reformed himself from the crime he had committed, which was rape. And rape is one of those crimes that it's not easy to turn a person around on. And he came out of prison a rapist. And I know that for a fact, and people in the party know that for a fact. So he should have never been recruited in the first place. But if you're lionizing people who come out of prison, and then this one here is coming out with a best-selling book and is beginning to try and sound like Malcolm X. I mentioned this before. When they tried to kill me in '66, and I was in a cast, and he come to my house with Marvin X and asking me to support Betty Shabazz, who the Panthers were bringing in to speak in the Hunters Point. And I said, yeah, I would. And then I was criticizing Eldridge for the way in which he was bringing whites back into the movement. So they take me on a ride because I needed a ride. I didn't have a car. And so I'm questioning Eldridge on what he had read. Had he read Frantz Fanon? Had he read Malcolm? Had he read? It was a whole bunch of, he hadn't read nothing. He was empty in the head, you know? So he had rhetoric, and I've noted some of the allies of the Black Panther Party, including some Puerto Rican allies, who said Eldridge was dangerous. Darn right he was. He tried to ambush the police in Oakland, which was absolutely stupid, and Bobby Hutton was killed. So understanding your social structure and where do you rest your power when you're organizing your people is crucial. In social structure analysis, I pointed this out, the best that's been done in this country on one sector, because our social structure is complex. The best analysis on the Black elite has been done by Lerone Bennett in the book Negro Mood, the chapter, The Black Establishment, which nobody reads, nobody reads. So, understanding social structure. So in the course of the campaigns that I was involved in, those were really lessons on how the white social structure was organized, who ran the country. That's how we were able to defeat corporations across the board, and beginning to look at the Black social structure. I see a comment here, Chad Jomo Kenyatta, Rip Geronimo Pratt. Geronimo Pratt was an ex-military veteran, received high awards in Vietnam, who played a major role in teaching the party how to defend themselves defensively against police attacks and stuff. And any chapter he trained, they came out alive. Because generally, when they attack your headquarters, if you can get out, get out. You can't defend a fixed position like that. I mean, but if you have to, then defend appropriately. And he sandbagged, put up big sandbags in their offices. And so when they faced an attack in LA, they came out without a single Panther killed. And Geronimo is one of the great leaders of the Black Panther Party, a beautiful brother, So the social structure analysis was key to Cabral then being able to pull together young people who he took out of Guinea-Bissau and trained in Guinea in organizing training. And he used a situational training method where they would train in how they approached the village and how they, if it was Balanta, how they would win over people there. And if it was Fulani or others, how they would move there. And so this was key. The social structure analysis was key to effective organizing of our people. And this was through leadership training. You will see Ana Maria Cabral in the interview that we have, that we've already recorded, that we'll play next week. She talks about the impact of that leadership training. Check out what she had to say. Now, in waging an armed struggle, Guinea-Bissau had problems. It's a small country. It doesn't have any mountains, which the Cubans had. It didn't have the kind of normal geographical terrain that works in a guerrilla warfare. But in the southern part, particularly of Guinea-Bissau, where the Balanta people were, due to heavy rainfalls and stuff, it had high foliage, high grass and stuff, where you could organize resistance and hide and hit and run. So they had to adapt to that. The geography favored the Portuguese in the sense that they had, trucks and vehicles and stuff, so they could move over what was a short geographical area quickly, and they could use their helicopters and air to drop stuff on you, which is what white people like to do. As cowardly as they can get, the better they are, So those were positives and negatives in the geography. But the key thing is, because of Cabral's effective situational analysis, he could use the strengths of the social structure of different African groups to his advantage. The key thing is this. The people that were really key to winning the war in Guinea-Bissau against the Portuguese were the Balanta people. Some call Balante, but Balanta people. Balanta. Balanta. The Balanta people were the first to join the struggle. Once they got past their elders, then the people, because they had no chiefs, they had no kings, They were being controlled by the Portuguese. It was a direct question of what did the people want. Well, the Volanta had waged the longest guerrilla struggle in Guinea-Bissau. And they viewed the PAIGC as an extension of that struggle. So the Volanta were the first to join and join in large numbers. And I want to say this, the first to join among the Volante people were the Volante women, because they not only had the opportunity to free themselves from Portuguese oppression, but to free themselves from what had occurred under colonialism, the ossified or frozen system of the classless age grade societies where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Well, under colonialism, the democracy was restricted to males, first to elders, and then to males. Women were taken out of the decision-making process. And so this was a feature of the democratic society that was not democratic. And so women were the first to join because they saw their opportunity to have a say-so. And as Ana Maria Cabral will point out next week, Amilcar Cabral insisted that the party of PAIGC at the local level, if they had a committee of 5 people, and those committees replaced the Council of Elders, they made the decisions at the village level. 2 of those 5 at least had to be women, and in some cases more than 2. And so this empowered African women to be involved in the struggle, and this was a key thing in the success of the armed struggle. But the key thing in the success of the armed struggle, and this has generally been missed by most historians on this, is the Volanta had perfected a method of armed struggle. And that method of armed struggle was the most effective method that PAIGC used, because what they would do is suck the Portuguese into these grassland areas where it was very muddy. They couldn't bring in, heavy machinery and stuff. And then they would retreat. And then the Portuguese would figure it was finished, so they would turn around. And when they turned around, the Volante would attack them. And so they used this method. And this method of guerrilla warfare was very effective. It was key, along with Cabral's strategies. It was a key to the success of the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau. Now, what's normally not pointed out is the Portuguese had a comeback, and it was under a general named Spinola. He used counterinsurgency against the forces of Amilcar Cabral. And this was a long struggle, over 10 years long. And some in the PAIGC were becoming discouraged. They didn't know when this struggle was going to be completed. Some were defecting. They weren't necessarily joining Spinola, they were running away and defecting from the struggle. And then Spinola also had a policy of releasing a number of PAIGC prisoners that had been held for a long time, including the person who had been second in command of PAIGC. And some of them came out supporting Spinola. And this is, of course, another problem you have in liberation movements. When you have so-called heroes in prison and they come out, and then you have others who have been engaged in struggle, what should you do with them? And one of the first things is you shouldn't just bring them back into the party. You need to check them out. You need to reorient them. That was the problem in Kenya with Jomo Kenyatta. That struggle was centered on free Jomo Kenyatta, Odinga, who was his vice president. His son has run against the son of Jomo Kenyatta later and been defeated through illegal elections. So their call was free Kenyatta. And when he got free, Kenyatta was pursuing British policies against the Mau Maus. And so they had turned him around, or he was turned around already. Who knows? But the key point is that was another strategy that Spinola was using. Spinola's counterinsurgency practices was to try and do the opposite of what Cabral did. So Cabral found the groups in the social structure that would support the struggle in Guinea-Bissau. Spinoza went after the groups in the social structure that were hardest to organize, like the Fulani, that would oppose, or at least their leaders would oppose the PAIGC, though some were recruited from each of these groups. So this counterinsurgency campaign, this was rough and tough, but Spinoza ended up losing it. Finally, and I want to conclude on this, most studies of Cabral's strategies leave the impression that victory came through the armed struggle, that Cabral's philosophy and strategy of struggle was shooting his way out and defeating the Portuguese army. Cabral never thought that. Cabral saw the armed struggle as the means of weakening Portuguese colonialism. He saw the armed struggle as the way in which he could put the Portuguese in a position where they would have to leave. But it was through international diplomacy that he saw the main way for achieving victory. And I talked to Amilcar Cabral's daughter after interviewing Ana Maria Cabral. She's a diplomat. Ana Maria Cabral played that role as well in the UN and in other ways. Diplomacy, along with Cabral's role in getting material and political support for the armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau, was the major role that he performed in the struggle for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Because without the material support, particularly Russia, that provided guns, and by the end of the war provided anti-aircraft material. And once they got anti-aircraft material, then the Portuguese were just plain finished, because if they couldn't wage a cowardly air war and drop stuff on the people, then they knew they were finished, especially when their helicopters and planes got shot out of the sky. That was it. But the point is, Cabral was able to bring in United Nations officials to come into the country and document the fact that the whole country had basically, at least most of the country, had been liberated. And so this is one of the few armed struggles where an international body, the United Nations, declares that PAIGC had been successful in achieving the independence of Guinea-Bissau. And that was key. Cabral was assassinated before that. And in assassinating Cabral, they were doing the same thing they did in this country to knock off a movement, knock off its head. And this was a huge setback for the people of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde later. But it did not set them back in achieving the independence of their country. In the case of Africans in the diaspora, Malcolm played that kind of role. When he's forced out of the Nation of Islam, he plays the role of a diplomat. And he's moving around the world, moving to get support for the Black Liberation Movement. When he said he's going to take the Black Freedom Movement and raise it to a human rights movement, he was internationalizing the Black Freedom Movement. And this was before Black Power had come on the scene. And so he was going before the Organization of African Unity. He was planning presentations before the United Nations. And in fact, he was scheduled to attend a major meeting of Africans and Asians and other revolutionary groups right after it would have occurred, right after he was assassinated. Godfather of Harlem, which James Smalls has provided a lot of script for, covers this. And Smalls knew something I didn't know, because he provided protection for Malcolm's sister after Malcolm's death. I didn't know Malcolm had a plane ticket for him and his wife and children to fly out of the United States the day after his assassination and fly to China. That was smart. He should have done that a year earlier. But that was not only a smart move to get out of the country because a lot of forces were out to get him, but to go to China, that would prove to be ultimately smart because China provided a place of refuge for a guy named Robert Williams, who had waged an armed self-defense movement in the South. And China is not a place that was going to just cave into the United States. So Malcolm was using diplomacy to win support for the Black liberation movement here. The group I'm in, Pan-African People's Organization, and other groups in this country did African liberation support work to provide material support to African liberation movements, including PAIGC. As I pointed out earlier, we worked in the villages in Tanzania. And today, we are using some of the lessons learned from Amilcar Cabral and Ella Baker to operate a leadership training academy called Per Ankh House of Life, which was the highest university system in ancient Kemet, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. Brandy Faulkner, who's been on this show, who is a 42-year-old full-time organizer and professor at Virginia Tech, is helping me on this, and we have others. We've done a lot of training over the years on this. And one of the key prerequisites in this is going through the six-fold stages of mental freedom that some of you have signed up for. As soon as we have 40, and we're getting close to that, we'll have time that we have to prepare for this training. It'll be a year-long training. And again, one of the requirements is going to be, you got to be doing something in your community. This isn't just reading books and talking about stuff. It's internalizing stuff and using it in building power in different ways in your community. So in conclusion, this show is honoring the greatest leader, I believe, in the 20th century, Amilcar Cabral. We focused on the liberation movement as an act of culture. We have looked at the background of Cabral and the role that his family played in his own development. We have looked at the way in which he was able to free his mind from assimilation to a point that he could be useful for his people. And a key point I want to stress here is that Cabral was trying to use that method to transform the mindset of the leaders in the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, because he knew this: it would be a people with a certain level of education that would end up running the state, the government of Guinea-Bissau, of Africa, of any African country. And he knew the chances were greater that these leaders could be gangsters than that they could be leaders that served the people. And so Cabral viewed what he called mental conversion as a moral choice, a decision by people who had become awakened to commit what he called, this is a Marxist term, class suicide. Huey Newton wrote a book called Revolutionary Suicide. Class suicide means that you would die as an elite who is arrogantly lording over and oppressing their people and become a servant of the people. And so Cabral was trying to transform the mindset of the leaders who he trained through organizing training so that they could be servants of the people. Because if not, they would become oppressors. And so we need to honor the great ones that we have produced, learn from them, and use them as a weapon for the liberation of our people. Forward ever, backward never. Hotep. So let's see what you all got to say. I've tried to keep these shows short. This one went 2.5 hours. Sorry, but that's what this one required. Because if we are assessing the sixfold stages based on consistent action, then from the drug addiction to the organized intra-movement violence, no, Huey absolutely didn't complete the stages. Yeah, correct. But that transformation is what is really key. Really key, And again, it's voluntary. So are you willing to undergo that process? See, to speak truth, do the truth in this day, that's what that requires. And Cabral reached another conclusion, He said, since it was the assimilated who had been brainwashed, they're the only ones that needed to go through what he called mental conversion. He said the masses of people didn't because they had created the culture. There's a lot of truth in that, and Ella Baker did not need to go through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Malcolm did because he had been assimilated, but his family did not because they had not only drawn from Black culture, which is African-based, but the deep culture of Garveyism that his father, who came out of African-American culture, and his mother, who came from Grenada, who came out of the deep culture of the Caribbean, they already had. So there's a truth to that some who are in the stage of Black or African culture may not have to undergo this, but there are contradictions in Black culture. We know. Black culture is, the basis for this popular culture, Blacks in the United States, the most popular in the world. But it has contradictions. And so it depends on the contradictions of the people coming out of Black culture, whether or not they need this transformation. Clarence Thomas came out of Black culture. He didn't come out of assimilation. It was Black culture. And he was, for a time, a member of the Black Student Union. He was a supporter of Malcolm X. But all along, he had internalized self-hatred. Hatred directed against him because of the Blackness of his skin. But he was coming out of Geechee culture, the strongest African cultures that we've produced in this country. But he had internalized self-hatred. He wrongly concluded that the movement of the 60s was defeated because we didn't completely end what you all call white supremacy. But we had singular victories, significant. It took us out of the new slavery of segregation. That was King's movement's victory along with the Southern movement's victory. The ending of legal apartheid and the victory of gaining the right to vote, which everything's being done to try and erode now. So there are those who come out of Black culture. Elijah Muhammad, some of the nation ain't gonna want to hear this, but Elijah was Black in his consciousness. And along with Fard Muhammad, they created a system of thought that was very appealing to the grassroots. And they were able to turn around a lot of people who were engaged in criminal behavior, drug addicts, whatnot, cold-blooded killers in some cases. So that was a good thing. But Elijah didn't like Africa. And Elijah had a color complex. He favored the light complexion people. It was one of the reasons he liked Malcolm, but the main reason was Malcolm's talent. So even Elijah Muhammad, who had some real strengths, he was well read in some of the Black stuff, J. Rogers and stuff like that. That was the negative spillover of Black culture. We got some of us trouble with Africa. So to the degree to which, and this is true also with the Volante, the example I gave, the Volante basically were the expressions of the best of African culture, but because of colonialism and the struggle between the sexes, and if you read Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I explain this. Shifts in power after the hunter-gatherer stage, in some cases, shift in favor more of the male than the female. And so in the Volante case, the fact that decision making was made by elders and then by males in the society was an example of that. So, in that sense, even the people who made the culture, to the extent that, as Cabral described it, it had been frozen or ossified, or as he said, when the European came in, it took us out of history because they were making the major decisions in our lives. It's when you return to history to make your own history, to battle them, to fight them, to eventually dethrone them from power, and through successive stages weaken them, that you're able to overturn this. But it's combined with a transformation of consciousness. What's the best book to read on Amilcar Cabral? There's not a best book. There's a whole bunch of books, you know. So he did a thing on return to the source. You need to read a whole bunch of stuff. There's not one thing. The latest thing that's come out on Cabral is a book called Amilcar Cabral, The Life of a Reluctant Nationalist. It's an interesting book, but there's a whole body of books that you need to read on Cabral. This is a book that I was rereading to prep for my interview with Ana Maria Cabral, Fighting Two Colonialisms, Women in Guinea-Bissau. Good book. I got a huge number of books on Cabral. You don't just want one. You want to get yourself deeply into it, because we are. Over to Shaka. You mentioned NOI, being successful in transforming criminals. But that criminal element is precisely what participated in Malcolm's death and other high-level crimes. Your thoughts? The majority of people in the Nation of Islam had no role in Malcolm's death, to the extent that the nation was involved. And if you look at the show that I did with Babazak Kondo on that, it shows their role. That was a decision of the leadership. And then those chapters that follow along, and most of them did because they were following orders. But it was essentially the corruption of the national leadership. And then there were some mosques that were criminal element mosques, but the majority were not, Okay. Where should I start? Depends on where you're at. When it comes to the transformation of consciousness, you start with the most basic stuff. So when we take people through this, you'll see how we do this when it comes to reading. Okay. M. Jewel, are you saying Winnie Mandela was the best leader of the 20th century? I hope not. She was important, but I hope not. Suggestion is I do a show on Jomo Kenyatta. Maybe. Okay, this is a statement. You cannot win a war with weapons made by others. A battle, perhaps. War, no. Who cares who makes the weapons? Listen, the Vietnamese won the war against the Americans, against the French, and put a nice little kick to the Japanese with weapons made by others. They didn't manufacture those weapons. A bullet doesn't care who manufactured it when it goes through you, And in fact, Ho Chi Minh made this comment. He aligned with the Russians, so he needed one white power against another white power. So he got anti-aircraft material that could shoot down American planes, and so forth. So, yeah, it's good when you're able to make your own weapons, but no, that isn't what you need to win a war. You need the weapons, And Cabral won his with weapons coming from other places. I mean, this is a very small country. I mean, they had no manufacturing center. Wally, defeat corporations. Yeah, brother. A lot of people are hungry right now. They ain't got jobs. That's one of the things we should be doing. In this case, for jobs. Because we are. Yes, Soul on Ice is a travesty. It is unsurprising that Cleaver died as a Reagan Republican Mormon. He was a survivalist. He had been really trained in prison, so he did whatever he could to survive. Because we are. It's critical to highlight the trap of low character being fundamentally contradictory to revolution. The holistic African understanding you embrace is why I accept your eldership. Morals is the key thing. And I've said this before. Kwame Ture and I were friends. And the biggest conversation we would have would be over the importance of the morality of anyone involved in struggle, especially revolutionaries. That's key. If you're, let's say, running a society, which you shouldn't, you should have a system where the people are involved in running it, then the morality is going to be everything in it. And if you see why a lot of these Western revolutions have become as abusive as the system they replaced, it's largely the morals of the leaders. Their primary love was the love of power. The Russians were very good at using terrorism as an instrument. And, so yeah, morals is key. Yeah. Heck, I wonder if Huey went through the sixfold stages. I think he started. There's no question he didn't complete it. Lisa, thanks for your compliment. That's nice. Question, do we know enough about African leadership to create a course of study to produce them? Hell yeah. Do you mean we? No, it depends on what your level of participation is. And in terms of leadership, the Per-Ankh House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership / Organizer Institute, it's a comprehensive curriculum. I got 63 years of doing this. My friend, Dr. Theophilo Benga, helped me with the Per-Ankh part. And we have a comprehensive curriculum. And so it's situational. We've trained people on battles, particular situations where some have been disempowered. We show them how to come back. And we have people who have been working with me for 50 years that help me out. And then there's others that we're tapping into. Brandy Faulkner is one. And with the experience of the younger generation, they piped into a whole new level of organizing this all group-centered leadership. They've been very effective. A lot of people who are Afrocentric don't seem to give them much credit. They deserve it. There's a comment here. False frailty drives the Karen syndrome in white females. Oh, that's a nice term for that. Yeah. Pretending to be useless, Miles Davis, kind of blue. Willie Wassett, kind of blue. Absolutely beautiful. Miles had this lyrical gift, a staccato gift done in short, staccato type playing, just absolutely beautiful. You've been to Gogis. Hope I got that right. I'd like to know more about the Zora Neale Hurston reference. Um, that is the one on the Black Church, the little small book on the Black Church, where she makes this reference. Let me get up here and pull this so I give the right reference here. This reference comes from a book called The Sanctified Church. A little small book. Powerful. Got all kinds of insights into Black culture, and that's where she made that comment, and it's key. That's a part. My thought is hieroglyphic thought coming from practice. It's situational, or it comes from the light, and that comes directly from God. That's the best. But then the next best is field-tested practice coming out of different battles and different situations, and you see what works. And then looking at what other people have done that also works, Gerard. Some of the great lyrical rappers are strategic with their flow, cadence and delivery, mental gymnastics. Yeah. Poetry. Poetry is at the soul of our culture. The blues is poetry, Good rapping is poetry. Hey, hi, Eba. Ah, good to see you. Amos Wilson Day, solving your problems is a sign of intelligence. Darn right. Good point. Marimba Ani said that your culture is your immune system. Very true. Yeah, there's another quote here. Dr. Jacob Carruthers said, thanks to Hegel, African culture is allowed to be ignored and disrespected. Yeah, Hegel basically lays out the philosophy of white racism. Gerard, I'm no scholar, but it seems that assimilation is part of the integration trap. Yes, true. Okay, Wally, the trick is not know thyself, but to realize self. Seems small, but makes all the difference. Well, I wouldn't make a distinction there. Both the same. Because that was a saying on the temples in ancient Kemet. Man, woman first, know thyself. And that's true. All knowledge proceeds from that. Assimilation works to the degree that you take on the mindset of someone else, in this case, your enemy, and you become your own worst enemy and your people's worst enemy. Yeah, good point. Assimilation makes you alien to yourself. Very true. Gerard, the best education is self-education. I've renounced my formal education which left me in debt, as well as my religiosity, which left me voidless of self-knowledge and inner spirit. Yeah, that's part of what John Henry Clark said. The best thing about the African mastery system that he underwent, because he didn't go to university, was that you didn't have to unlearn stuff. But in this miseducation system, well, you might get a few things you need depending on what it is. So much is what you don't need and messes you up. You got to discard it. And that takes work. Yeah, people are talking about the importance of culture. Lao Tzu seems to have problems on this divination thing. So his question is, in regards to the science of divination, why was no reading made of Cabral and other African leaders to preserve their lives? Cabral knew that the Portuguese were going to kill him. He wrote a paper on it just before he died. He knew he had captured some of the people who were going to kill him. He knew that the Navy, they had a very small Navy, was a cesspool of people who were scheming to kill him. What Cabral didn't do was take the appropriate measures. And he should have been under heavy bodyguard. Some of the people that he knew had been recruited to kill him were allowed to walk freely. And it was among them that the assassins came. And he was eventually murdered in the presence of his wife, Ana Maria Cabral. So he didn't need divination. They already knew it. It was Cabral that didn't take the measures, and he should have. Malcolm knew that he was going to be killed, and he spent a year dancing around it when his butt should have done something. I'm not blaming him for his own death, but I'm saying he could have done a better job in this. There's a picture with Cabral, a white guy next to him. That's a Russian who was training the people in the back. These were Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verdeans who are being trained in various skills. The tallest African there, with his hands behind his back, is the person that shot Cabral. And he was a Guinea-Bissauan. So, and divination does do that. And if you all get off your theoretical behinds and go get one, you'll find how accurate that is. Castro faced over 400 assassination attempts and was able to overcome them in part because he had a good security apparatus. He also used divination, Ifa. In fact, his Orisha is the same as mine. His was. He's not alive anymore. Obatala, you know. So who says divination didn't tell you? And in fact, diviners have predicted the coming of the European. Prediction's good when it's accurate, but it's what you can do with it. You know, I'm alive because my Babalawo predicted my death, and I've been dead if he hadn't taken measures to change it. But see, some of you don't believe that because you're into the theory of things, and if it ain't following the white boy's thing, it can't possibly be real. You know what I mean? I know a lot of you aren't, but I'm just making this point. You know, see if there's anything else. I already answered Lao Tzu's question that he considered the possibility of life would be taken did he develop a strategy for continuing of the revolution in his absence. Yes, one of his biggest strategies there was that he had a decision-making process in place. And that was a consensus decision-making process. And Cabral was at the center of that because they were very lucky to have someone of these kinds of gifts. So his fingerprints were all over every decision, but it was consensus. He didn't come and impose stuff on people. They had discussion and arrived at an agreement. And it was usually following a lot of things that Cabral recommended, but not always. So he left a consensus-making, decision-making process. After his death, that was not followed. It wasn't because he didn't try and instill it. Wolf Bandler was talking about the role of family and predators. Very good point. Wolf Bandler, he's making the point that even when your religion may have been watered down, spirit is key. Yeah. And I'm going to tell you, spirit's not watered down. Wherever spirit takes place, it's strong. The enemy mistook our kindness for weakness. Yeah, true. Because theirs is a cruel system. But we don't give up our kindness. We just have to be strong in defending ourselves and to know how far we go with it, too. Wolf Manlou, you imagine how much stronger Malcolm and Amilcar would have been had they known the teachings of the 12th. Yeah. But what's interesting is with Amilcar Cabral is his basic formula for a just society, which was based on empowering females, was basically leading to that same conclusion of equal male-female empowerment. Wolf Manlou is making the point that it's important to know the origin of the 6 major religions. True. Foreign models don't celebrate family. True. Because we are, say it again for the back, so many attempt to be revolutionary using a foreign model that ignores the internal domestic sphere of family formation. Yeah, and that family formation in hunter-gatherer societies is the origin of the world's first economies and the basis for just societies. Social structure, family structure is the beginning of everything. Strong or weak, positive or negative. Do you feel that by Amilcar's learning the teachings of his adversaries, this made him a better and more effective leader warrior? Yeah, sure. As long as you don't internalize those teachings, you have to know yourself and know your enemy. Those are the 2 rules of war. And pull out of whatever from your enemy's arsenal you can use, but not see the world through your enemy's eyes. Wolf Manlou, the Portuguese were enslaving Africans before the transatlantic slave began. Yeah, that's true. With the fall of Moorish power in Spain, that's when they began their enterprise. 1492. 1500s, they began their enterprise. Thank you. So appreciate the emphasis on etymology. Understanding the origin of words is very important. Malcolm X saw that too. That was one of his things. This is an important point. Law and disorder. No, I haven't heard about this brother. Let me write his name down here. Frederick Douglass Kilpatrick. Write this down. Law and disorder. I assume that's on internet. I'll check that out. Yeah, because I've been trying to get in touch with some old deacons, so I'd work with them. I have my own reasons for wanting to connect. So, Kalahari Danjuma, thanks for that information. You know, okay. Okay, 7323. KPFA. Okay, I'll check that out. Thanks for that information, brother. Appreciate that. Michael Mayberry, thanks for the little thing. I'm no God, though, other than we all are. We all got God in us. Okay, let's see. What's the African area of Mexico? Morelos. Morelos. Yeah, Wolf Manley was making this point. You should take notes on these shows. You know, I do prep, so you're just trying to remember. You're not going to remember all of it. Oh, Susan Tata was watching from the camera rooms. Hey, right on, Susan. Wow. Wow. See if there's anything below. where or when do you sign up for the classes? Just send in to me underneath the show when you type in questions or something. Send in your request that you'd like to enroll, and I'll have your email address and I'll respond. We'll sign you up. Who said that the Russians were not white? They're the original Aryans. Okay. Okay, that's it. Hotep. Hope you all got something out of this. Let people know about next week's show interview with the great Ana Maria Cabral, Amilcar Cabral's wife. And that will be dealing with the role of women warriors in the battle for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau.